The first thing that comes to my mind is the fact that each of us has a mental lens. And you have heard somewhat of the prescription in Ben's mental lens. And each of us, whether we identify it or not, have a mental lens by which we view. People who write call them worldviews or perspectives. But we come, each of us here, with a variation on those lenses or worldviews. I'm going to just in this 10 minutes just lay out my own. It will in many ways be similar to Ben's, but it will have some quite remarkable differences. First of all, I have no problem whatsoever with qualia being sense experience and it being perfectly natural. I come from a Latin Catholic background. My training is in that type of philosophy, but I have no problem whatsoever with seeing qualia as purely natural. I would not put supernatural layers on it at all, coming from my own perspective. So that's one point of likeness. But my frame of reference, or my view, what you might say the lens, the prescription in my lens, is a little bit different than Ben's on consciousness. If we begin to deal with human consciousness, which I feel philosophically is the key in the future to any advance philosophically, in fact, I would strongly hold that the metaphysics that we have been dealing with since medieval times has to be completely reconstructed in terms of quantum physics. There's just no way that we can deal with the static metaphysics that we have inherited philosophically from the medieval period. It has to be redone. In terms also of active cognition, the understanding of consciousness that was not possible in that medieval period, they by intuition knew, Aquinas and others knew of psychological reality, but they had no thematizing of it. They had no way of really dealing with it in a theoretic, carefully constructed way, because the science of psychology had not been born yet. And so they dealt kind of with it by the seat of their pants, if you might say. When I deal with consciousness, and from my studies, which took place in Canada, I deal with it in a little different manner. I view the human being as totally natural in three dimensions. The first of those dimensions is what I would call the organism, and it's that which is known most commonly by most of us. We know its systems, we know its functions, we know the medical establishment deals with that, and God help us, if we get sick, we hope they know what they're doing and they're not a quack. And so the organism would deal with digestion, neurotransmission, blood circulation, respiratory, reproduction, and the rest that we could all list. Contrary to what's being done in popular literature today, I would not find adequate at all the triad of body, mind, and spirit. I feel that's totally inadequate. I would ask you, and maybe you want to comment, where are the emotions in that triad? Well, some people will say, well, they're in the body, of course. Some people will say, oh, no, they're in the mind. What do you mean by mind? What do you mean by an emotion? So instead of body, mind, and spirit, my direction would be to say organism, psyche, and spirit, all of which are natural. I am not bringing anything in here of the divine at this point. Which means then I have to establish how the spirit of a human being is purely natural. And I am prepared to try and do that as we continue our discussion. Psychic information, what do I put there? Very clearly, I would put the whole area of fantasy, the whole area of dreaming, the whole area of consciousness capable of creating images, and then connecting those images in what I would call imagination. I differ. I would distinguish between image and imagination. image is just simply, I say, Macintosh apple. But if I start the Genesis story and talk about, a fruit from a tree, and everybody concludes it's an apple, although it really is never mentioned as an apple, you've got much more a connection of images in a narrative symbol we call a myth to try and get at some profound truth about humanness. But, it's using symbolic image connections. So that, for me, would be imagination. Also, in the psychic area would be motors. And these motors are 11 powerful emotions. They were clarified by Aristotle, picked up again by Aquinas. And today, if you read in emotional, psychological material, they are not really dealt with sufficiently. The field is quite eclectic, where it's a little bit pick and choose. But therapists will come down on 4 of the motors: mad, glad, sad, and scared. That's where your therapy is more or less centered, and emotional life. Those, in the terms I'm using, would be, 2 of them would be spontaneous emotions, and 2 would be considered emotions. We can go into that later on if we want to. Then what in heaven's name is the human spirit, if it's not something divine, but perfectly natural? I would describe it functionally. And if these can't be evidenced in your experience, then we need to question further. First of all, I would suggest that part of the human spirit, the functions of the human spirit, must be able to be distinguished from the animal realm to be human. So we're talking psychic information is very much shared by the animal realm. So is the organism stuff. But when you start talking human spirit, then we are learning more and more about the consciousnesses of porpoises, of orangutans, and others, and we're still asking, how does that consciousness flow differ from the human? I would designate 4 major functions in what I call the human spirit. The first is wonder. Far as I know, my puppy hasn't looked at the sunset and said, gee, that's gorgeous. Far as I know. Maybe we'll find out later that they're capable of some type of awe or wonder. Second, the inquiry patterns that our minds form. Questions for inquiry. Third, you have the conclusions as data is gathered. And fourth, an evaluative judgment moving to decision. I think those functions belong in some particular way to human beings. There is nothing divine about them as far as the supernatural that Ben mentioned. They are perfectly natural. The question that I would end with is that, in my perspective, this area, what I call the human spirit, is wide open. It is not closed on measurable, the instruments we have for measuring. It's wide open. That means it's open to transcendence. And that opens it to the influence of the holy upon the human. But there is, you have to deal with the anthropology, with the basic equipment. And I think that's what we all share in common. I'll stop there.